this talk originally started off life as a bit of a nudge to people in the passive house community who are sort of get quite excited about taking existing buildings to passive house standard. And it's kind of my thoughts on what passive house can offer retrofit, whether it's all about chasing numbers or whether the advantage of passive house thinking is more about thinking about building physics. So it's called Retrofit, How Far to Go. Lots of, I think, different viewpoints today on that and in terms of what the risks are. All of us know these graphs, but I kind of always include them in presentations because it reminds me of why I think retrofit's important. That heating homes is about 20% of our UK emissions based on these two bits of information, and that's why retrofit continues, I think, to remain ever important. But I think a lot of people in construction think there's new build and there's retrofit, and there's just these two boxes and they're slightly different things. I think new build is, by and large, a lot of commonalities. Retrofit, these are some projects I'm currently engaged in or have been engaged in fairly recently. Clearly, these properties are very different. They at least look very different. And certainly underneath they're very different. And even if you go from this house to next door, you find more difference. So I'm not going to focus on cost especially. This is a talk delivered by somebody who's trained as a passive house designer, so it's from that perspective. I'm interested in performance, thermal performance, and my one-line answer to the question how far to go is that it depends. So I think when I started retrofitting, and to some extent I think this is carrying on now, there's a dash for kind of performance and a dash to stick stuff on walls and try and get the best U value possible, the least energy flow. But in either of these diagrams, which don't represent anything like the worst that's going on out there, it's I think that's quite ham-fisted as an approach. In terms of standards, how well they fit to those new build and retrofit sector or existing building sector, I think for new build, working with passive house for me is a no-brainer. I think you'd be crazy not to design new buildings to passive house standard. But for existing buildings, many of the decisions you have as a designer are closed. Your options are often severely restricted, often by cultural and physical things. There's a lot to understand about the building that you're about to operate on. And so pursuing passive house standards blindly, I think, is likely to be dangerous. And something of, most of the retrofit for the future houses, by default, we're kind of pursuing passive house to one degree or another. And some of the things which went wrong, I think, were as a result of that. But going back to sort of, what things look like, actually, appearances are often deceptive because these are all new build passive houses, and we think, wow, those are all completely different buildings. But when you get down to sort of the micro level, in terms of what's going on with all those walls and all those windows, actually the diagrams will look sort of increasingly similar. There'll be a lot of, big thick block of yellow somewhere in all those walls, and all the German type passive house windows will all kind of neatly align with that yellow stuff, and there won't be much thermal bridging. So although those things look different, they're actually, I think, terribly similar. Whereas this stuff, it looks different and it is very, very different. So before doing anything in retrofit, some basic assessment of whether it can take additional loads of things you're plugging on, like insulation, and I mean loads in sort of a general way. Whether it can take the loss of space, so often the imposition of kit or insulation plays hell with the internal planning and often disrupts the use of the space. Lots of talk about moisture. It's kind of the current bogeyman in the retrofit world. But also cultural impacts, and I spend a lot of my time speaking to planners about conservation areas, but, cultural impacts apply to buildings we may feel less passionate about at the moment, but, simply retrofitting them badly because they're not great buildings to start off with is not a great way forward. In terms of things which might be, relatively straightforward, and I say that as, very relative term, this is Andy Simmons' house, which is what I call a full wrap. So, just putting a blanket over the top of the existing building to achieve, amazing energy results. That seems, relatively low risk in terms of most of those criteria. You're not affecting space. The existing structure can take that, albeit there was some reinforcing and extension of the roof structure to accommodate the insulation that wraps up over that roof. And projects like this are another, a sort of a full wrap at big scale. So these are first demonstrator projects showing that you can take, 60s housing, which perhaps, nobody's going to stop you interfering with too much, changing it quite radically to get to passive house levels of performance. So, that stuff, if not economically quite within reach for everybody, at least is sort of what I think are the easier bits. But most of my life is engaged in what I think are the harder bits. And this is a slide Robert Cohen used earlier on. It's one of my clients. So it's, there's a few million or so houses which are harder to treat, which culturally we've got stronger ties with, going up to some, very strong ties here. And somebody did ask me a few years ago whether we should muck about with this stuff, and I actually said no. And now I'm working on one, and I think actually these buildings have got a lot to play, even if their numbers aren't enormous. So why are these important? So the sheer number, the millions of those houses, and the fact that they're the worst performing clearly makes them interesting from that perspective. And they're often owned by the richest and the poorest ends of society, actually. And so each community has got a vested interest in changing the way those buildings perform. And it's going to take time to develop robust approaches for this stuff. So, I think a lot of conservationists are of the view that, leave the, the kind of the vulnerable stuff alone for now until we know better, until somehow one day we'll just know how to deal with it. I think we'll only learn how to deal with these buildings by trying stuff. And there's a long-term risk that some of these properties may become unusable because they're simply so energy intensive. So the full wrap's often not possible or desirable because of the big architectural impact it makes. And we've got a lot of vulnerable homes where increasingly internal wall insulation becomes likely, and we know of increasingly what the risks are. But the other sort of thing I'd like to talk about is windows. So internal wall insulation and windows are two very tricky issues which don't seem to get any easier to solve. And the properties I showed earlier on, the ones that working on my practice, they're all very different, but they are at least all located in one place in London where I'm familiar with what the climate does. But location and other contextual issues are absolutely important in dealing with, in working with internal wall insulation. As is, I think, remediating existing problems before you start to think about installing wall insulation. Long-term management of moisture, and possibly using hydrothermal modelling to help you assess what the relative risks are. So the emphasis, I think, shifts from managing absolute energy use to what's appropriate in terms of wall insulation. So this is the sort of diagram we'd use early days to assess a property and start to understand a property. So it's doing, similar things to Peter and so on were talking about, but using kind of visual media. This is a rather more intense drawing, which we did for other reasons, but doing it helped us understand the very complex nature of this structure and how the internal structure related to the quite massive brick structure. But understanding exactly how this wall worked with the sash windows and shutter boxes is a key part of figuring out the building before we started applying solutions. And spending quite a lot of time in these properties too, at the start, understanding what they're made of behind the wallpaper. Thermographic imaging often helps, in this case, to identify long-term moisture ingress problems. So the dark areas were clues that there was something going on with moisture. In most of these cases, moisture coming through either leaky gutters or through damaged brickwork, and subsequent uncovering revealed what the problem was. So having kind of understood the building in quite some detail, moving forward and doing quite a lot of very detailed design. So this is kind of the opposite extreme of rather ironically what happens on much bigger projects where almost no design is done. And this particular detail is one of the more challenging ones we've grappled with. So relatively complex geometries, often limited opportunity for insulation, but trying to manage insulation, make cold bridging as little as possible. And also, in this instance, trying to detail in a very slim piece of secondary glazing to this important artefact. I mean, more common detail problems occur in parapets, and we spent quite a lot of time thinking about how we insulated the roof very well, but avoided potential soggy warm cell, I suppose, which is a bit of a concern. And also around sill details to sash windows. The more buildings we look at, the more we find there's a common failure here of moisture getting in at this point. And so we've, with all these sorts of buildings, we spend quite a lot of time trying to remediate these details and stop moisture coming in. So this is where sort of the approach becomes more clear in terms of the impact on buildings. So, I think looking at internal wall insulation, if you're going to do it really well, then I think stripping back to bones, really, so that you can find out where the rotten timbers are already and sort those out. That's a skirting board below a sash window, and as soon as we took it off, we realised there was quite a lot of water ingress there. Rot had started to set in, so arresting that before the insulation work started. So remediation, there's some, top left, there's some, you can probably just about make out some plugs being drilled into some timber lintels in this case, and the injection of boron paste is it's a slight insurance measure in case moisture finds its way in when this bit of building gets sealed up again. The removal of some timbers which had clearly, advanced stages of rot in that case. That was below a leaky gutter. But as well as sort of remediating kind of problems, tackling with these historic buildings, tackling the brickwork. So Harry spoke at greater length this morning in his presentation about a project they worked on, and the importance to sort out both the breathability of walls like this, but also, this entire bit of chimney has been rebuilt because moisture had been slowly sort of getting in there over probably decades and causing a long-term problem. And you could practically lift the bricks off one after another. But from downstairs, it wasn't especially obvious that was a problem. It was only when we'd identified it as a likely issue, and then from the scaffold we were able to realise there was a substantial bit of rebuild there. So it's managing moisture, but it's also stopping driving rain just leaking in. So that's a little bit about our approach with internal wall insulation. I want to finish off with some thoughts about windows, because this is kind of my other preoccupation at the moment. So those are two examples of what I call a classic German triple glazed window being slotted into different architectures. And perhaps the one on the left is probably more palatable for most people. I think the one on the right is quite interesting. And if you look at drawings by Palladio and other Renaissance architects, the aesthetic they were aiming for was not so far removed from this. In any case, I think there's so much energy passing through a single glazed window of that size. I think that sort of treatment shouldn't be dismissed. But in a listed building, perhaps that would be going too far. So this is the slide I showed you earlier on, this sort of detailed section where we try to incorporate very slim secondary glazing. And that's a sort of graphically real representation of the impact it had on that room, or we expect it to have. And so this is an ongoing debate with the local authority at the moment in terms of proportionality. How much damage we're having on that room compared to how much energy we might be saving. Up in Scotland, this is in Edinburgh, they've had similar debates, and some of the people speaking today have been involved in projects like this. So Nick Heath was part of this project to investigate the impact of double glazing and evacuated glass. So this is a sash window which has been retrofitted with evacuated glass. You can just about see the evacuation points on those panes there. You're talking about a sort of 5 times improvement in terms of energy loss through that window, and I think on a lot of buildings, I would question the cultural impact on that, whether it's really a big problem. So returning back to sort of the point at the start, in terms of where you might end up in terms of specific heat demand in kilowatt hours per square metre per year, this is sort of the range that I seem to be finding. Not all of these projects are my own. This is the one Harry Patakas presented earlier on down in Clapham. This is another one by my life partner who works for Paul Davis and Partners, and that project just about achieved full passive house status. But these ones in the middle sort of not so fussed whether they're passive house or not, but quite low heating demands are possible, I think, and I don't think we should give up on these buildings and consign them to much higher necessarily. This one, I say 25 to 40 because it's very much dependent on where we end up with the window design on that one. So my conclusion, if I have one, is that understanding the context and the building are the important things rather than chasing specific targets. And letting what the building wants to do dictate the energy target as much as any other issue. So considering the comfort of the building as much as the occupant, and nobody ever talks about comforts of buildings, but for me, I kind of feel it as an architect. So there's pay particular attention to moisture. But if you're going to go with deep measures, then going back to bones, I think, is the only way to do it successfully. And it means you avoid the risks of half measures. And so, I think the bandwidth in terms of heating demand of sort of 15 to 40 is where I try and operate, and I think that is potentially the what we could do, and that would be close to sort of 70 or 80% emissions reductions. And that's That's all I've got to say. Thank you very much. Sorry for